So, the last thing that I want to do is say some things about how functionalist perspectives and social conflict perspectives might differ in terms of sort of models of power, how we might think about power. And this is important again as a citizen of the United States, I'm assuming, most of you at least. Um, just generally in our culture, in a republic, democracy, or any person in any society, I think at some point we'll wonder about what kind of power do they actually have. Remember, there are multiple sources of power. In our country, we celebrate this idea of the power of the people, especially the power of people in numbers. But and we recognize that some people have more power than others. And when we participate or fail to participate or choose not to participate, political challenges and when we don't participate politically, sometimes the reason is because we discount or disbelieve that our voice actually has any kind of power or makes any kind of impact. And we also, again, believe that politicians themselves are power hungry all the time and they just want to take care of themselves and they're just lying about things and they're not really operating in our own best interest. So there's always a lot of challenge that comes around with that. And I'm not telling you what to think in that way, one way or the other. I think understanding how the structure and the system works is helpful. But the fact is that people don't always feel like that they have power or that their vote counts. So I at least want to say some things about the ways that people might think about power. For functionalists, this question of Harold Laswell says who gets what, when, and how as the definition of politics. The reason why I like that definition so much is because when we look at this from a functionalist perspective, sometimes what we'll talk about is a pluralist model. And a pluralist model of power essentially says that there's a lot of power and it is just spread amongst many competing interest groups. And the idea of that is if you consider politics to be an arena of negotiation, again, like don't just immediately think of the government, but think about the idea of who gets what, when, and how, particularly in a representative democracy. The idea is that there is someone. Let's think about the Washington D.C. as if it is a sports arena. There's somebody who shows up at the stadium to represent your needs, and they're in the stadium with somebody else that's representing somebody else's needs. So all of the elected Congress people, all of the elected senators, all of the social movement protest groups, all of the special interest groups, everybody who is sort of showing up to represent a certain amount of interests, they are essentially showing up for the arena, for the sports event, right? And at the point where the bell is rung, following whatever the rules of that particular sport is, the idea in the pluralist model is that we all have a voice. We all have interests that we are fighting, and inherently, no single group or interest is more important than the other group. Those operations or the organizations that are there, the representatives that are there, they are sometimes the way that you figure out how to best negotiate is you might create alliances so that, if I can gather with a whole lot of people here that have a similar interest, then maybe we can be better about getting the things that we want because we can sort of fight together. And in that negotiation means that maybe we've got a compromise. You can get two things that you want and I can get three things that I want because you've got some stuff that doesn't fit with me or I got some stuff that doesn't fit with you, but we might have a better chance putting up a combination of our compromises instead of individually fighting for what it is that we want. So it's the arena of negotiation. I think this envisioning of sort of the political process as negotiation between competing interests. And because functionalists believe that we have a pluralist system or that politics can be considered in this pluralist model, Functionalists might intend to think that things like demonstrations and protests and rallies are like irrational outbursts of behavior. Essentially, the idea is that if we have a pluralist model, and if we have a government or a formal process by which one's voice can be considered and heard, then why do this in an outburst kind of way? Why not just follow the channels of what it is that are there for you to be able to do? And that's sometimes where that challenge breaks apart, where people feel like, well, the system isn't set up in such a way to really listen to my voice or hear my voice or represent my voice. And sometimes I think personally that we feel like that because we don't exactly necessarily know how the process works or even how long the process might work, or the fact that sometimes somebody else has won the argument, if you will, and we may need a different strategy. So the pluralist model essentially says that power is spread amongst many competing interest groups. And what you're seeing is their negotiation and the outcomes of that negotiation. The power elite model is more of a, I think, a social conflict theorist model. It essentially says that power is concentrated amongst a small group of people who control much of the society. And we've seen this distinction of the power elite model otherwise, which means if you are looking in a textbook and you're trying to find the definition of it, you might not find it in the political chapter. You may have to find it in another chapter. And I don't remember where we were talking about it before. But we get this from C. Wright Mills, the same person who gave us the sociological imagination. And the power elite is considered to be these super wealthy individuals, these super, politicians, executives, celebrities, military leaders, people who have a whole lot of money and a whole lot of influence, or people who are in a position to have a whole lot of influence or a whole lot of power. They have access to national and international power because of their influence, and they might be placed by some other legitimate means in an authoritative position to utilize that power. The rules of society will tend to be stacked in their favor because they are the most influential. They have the most money, for instance. They have the most legitimacy in order to sort of use their power in a ways that people will respect. And they're not, again, it's no reason to necessarily think that they're going to be corrupt and they're just trying to do things the way that they want to because they're bad people. But if you think about politics as a negotiation of who gets what, when, and how, then they're more likely going to be in the position to stack things in their favor or manipulate the processes in such a way that they will get as much as they want and, by opposite, avoid losing the things that they don't want to lose. Can that get corrupt? Can they get nasty? Can that get greedy? Can that unfairly take power away from other people who are not in those positions? Absolutely, that can be the outcome, but that's not necessarily the setup, if you will. So when we think about the different types of government, monarchies, a totalitarianism or authoritarianism, that's one of the reasons why we might think about who is in those power elite positions, because the power elite is going to have the ear of the monarch, for instance, or the power elite might be the only group of people that's truly around an individual monarch leader or an individual leader in such a way that maybe they don't allow for the participation of the people in participating in their actual government. So it's important to think about that power elite, because even in a representative democracy, for instance, by virtue of our Constitution, we're not set up in such a way that the people won't have a voice. But because of the way that power works, and because power can be used by people with lots of money, or used by people who are spouting the ideas that people want to hear, or used by people who are able to sort of force others to do things what they can. Power comes from a lot of sources. You may wind up with, even in a representative democracy, an assessment that says power really is happening and only being negotiated and traded and used in these very small amount of people. So social conflict theorists will generally consider the way that power is operating in that. And it's not necessarily in this case that power is not spread or that there isn't an imbalance of power, but systematically there's a sort of a powerful few in the way that capitalism works, Karl Marx would say, and takes us back to that economic conversation, is that the people who are at the bottom of that stratification system, when you say like one voice, one vote, that is still true, but that one vote might not matter just by itself because the system is not really set up to move based on whether or not you said something. So there's a final picture that I want to paint, and there was a video that I watched that I will try to link here. I think it's a TEDx video talking about the three laws of power. They're not inherently good or bad, but they just are. One of those things is that power is never static. It's always accumulating, it's always decaying, it's always taking action, it's always being acted on. It is never static. It's always changing. It's always moving. The second thing is that power is like water. It's like if you think about the way that a river moves, for instance, there's a current and it's always going through all the streams of life. It is always, first of all, it's never static. It's always moving, but it's kind of just flowing like water. And the way that water does is that it compounds. Water begets more water, right? Power begets more power. Power begets more power because it's always moving, it's always static, it's always flowing. The problem with that, though, is that the lack of power begets more lack of power. The lack of power begets more lack of power. Powerlessness begets more powerlessness, because that means that maybe the power is moving in the other direction. And the compound effect of losing power means that you will continue to lose power. Something like a constitution or something that is formally written for a government or for an organization is written so that you don't have those kinds of problems, so that you can always go back to that document and figure out what is it that we're supposed to be doing? How are these decisions supposed to be made? The last thing about that is when I think about water, that's another really good way to think about politics. It's the attempt to sort of decide where should that water be? Who needs water? How can you harness the flow of that water that's always going to be there? It's always moving. It's touching everything in the world. How can we sort of harness that water and put it where it is that we need to put it? That's what politics is about. Who needs water? When and how are we going to get it to them? When do they need it? How are we going to get it to them? And policy, the final decision on how to do that water, is like freezing the water in place. You're saying these people, this group, this situation needs water, and they need the water to come into this area like this, and they need it to be in this area in this manner for a particular amount of time. It freezes and perpetuates the water to happen in a certain way. The time where it gets scary, for instance, is if something is happening to that ice, something is happening to that policy. We're thawing it out and we're changing it, or too much water. Something has happened with the system, and now ice is sort of cracking, or ice is sort of more water is on top of it, and then the ice is just growing out of control, right? But really, it's just thinking about what is it that people need, when do they need it, and how they need it, and who makes those decisions, and how do we make sure that it gets done. And power comes from, there's so many sources of it. We will actually talk about power again when we're talking about the people, when we're talking about social movements and collective action. So that's the end of that.